So, ladies and gents, the last of our discussion panels today. Again, I'm just going to introduce our moderator and she can then introduce the panel, can introduce themselves. Delighted to have Lizzie Peters from the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, another good friend of the London Policing College and to policing in general, but certainly policing in London. And as a resident, Lizzie, I'm always grateful for the support in the background. Our last session of the day around about legitimacy and probably bringing some of the threads of the day together, I should think, in certainly looking at the panel you've got in front of you there. So without further ado, Lizzie, over to you.
Work? Yes, yeah. Good afternoon for the penultimate session. It's really, really good to be here. And I suppose to continue the conversation that's been running throughout the day. And we've heard some really fascinating and excellent speakers. I suppose for me today has been a much needed, but I suppose I didn't even realise, but a much needed opportunity to reflect on the last 18 months and the work that we've all been doing sort of in policing through the pandemic, really. I suppose just wanted to reflect as well on how nice it is actually to be here in the room. It's just a joy to see familiar faces and meet new people. So I think that's just really nice to be here. And quite a relief as well after the times that we've all had. In terms of taking the conversation further, I think this panel is here to discuss police legitimacy and what is the new normal. I think a really important question and a really vital lens for policing as we move into this sort of aftermath of the pandemic. So in order to discuss this question and discuss legitimacy at this time, this point in time, I'd like to welcome Rod Jarman, Britt and Jonathan, who will all just introduce themselves.
You've all heard a little bit from me earlier on today. I'm Rod Jarman, 32 years with the Met Police. I'm the lead for police education and research at the University of West London, but that's just about to change with the creation of the new Institute of Policing. But I have been involved in police education for the past 10 years. And prior to that, served in the Met, where I was Deputy Assistant Commissioner, and really keen for these sorts of events to widen people's understanding of policing.
Well, hello everyone. Well, earlier, you know, since my presentation, I'm Maj-Britt Rinaldo Ronnebro from the Swedish police. It's a national police, and I'm the so-called national lead for crime prevention, and particularly education within this. I'm also the Secretary General of the International Police Association and a board member at the International Education Center Gimbon, which IPA, the International Police Association, are connected to very heavily. And a few other things that I also enjoy, like being the ambassador for the National Symphony Orchestra in Sweden. That is part of my extra, not only policing. I'm still a serving police officer, and I counted 45 years in August this year, and I got 40 years of membership in the IPA. So I just say, come on, work longer than you do over here.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jonathan Jackson. I'm a senior lecturer in policing and security studies at Birmingham City University. I'm also the course director for the BSc in professional policing, which is obviously part of the PEQF. I wrote the course for that. And I also wrote the MSc in policing and intelligence analysis. And I promise it's not an advertisement for BCU, which is what it sounds like. My specialist area is the history of policing. And in particular Victorian policing, which, as you can imagine, all my students are thrilled with every time they get a lecture from me. They see Jonathan, they think, oh my days, I think it's time to go. But yeah, so hopefully I can talk a little bit about that today, and from a historical perspective, lessons learned actually from the past, because obviously I know we are in COVID at the moment, and there's obviously a big emphasis on that at the moment. but we've dealt with these situations before for hundreds of years, and actually, you know, we can really pull some development points from that. So yeah, looking forward to it, and also, of course, incredibly humbled to be in a room. I've not been a cop. I never have been a cop, but to kind of listen to the thoughts of all of you is really quite fascinating. So thank you.
So we've got a really well qualified panel in terms of experience, in terms of bringing an international perspective and historical perspective. So I'm going to kick off with asking a question, and then there'll be an opportunity for you also to ask questions and share your thoughts as well. So I'm going to start by asking Rod, would Robert Peel recognise the police of 2021? Do you think policing lives up to the principles that were set out in 1829?
I suppose the first thing is I wonder what those first police officers would make of something a couple of 100 years on, where we have people in a room from various countries talking about policing with a common model, which has evolved in many places across the world from the principles that were laid out in 1829. Now, we have someone from Scotland here, so I'm going to love saying this. Of course, the Metropolitan Police was the first real police service to be created in the modern format, and the Glasgow Police didn't survive, so they don't really count, even though they were 10 years earlier. But when we think back, or when I think back, and Jonathan will probably be better at this than me, in 1829, the police service was created to take over from the Bow Street Runners, to take over from the structures that were built around the office of constable and built around a policing role which was completely ill-defined. It was at a time of industrialization, and what we have seen happen since then is a creation of a codification, if you like, a set of laws, a set of ways of doing business, which has created a structure, which is what the police in the UK are today. And there have been various phases, and I love that whole four industrial revolutions concept. I think it's really, really powerful in policing terms. But do I think that what was created then is right for now? I think that's a really fundamental question. I still 100% believe that the notion of the public of the police and the police of the public should be at the core of everything that we're thinking about. That police officers are nothing other than members of the public who have got a role within society for the benefit of the rest of society, that they're not something set aside. And I think that is fundamentally important. But I would say, I think we're at a real crisis in terms of what that means. And I think Alison sort of went into some of the issues around fragmentation of society. What is the public? Who are we part of the public of? Globalization. How does policing in one part of the world connect with policing in other parts of the world? And how much more complex that makes the whole relationship between the police and the public as a structural entity. And I also think we're at a point with the transformation rather than progressive development that digital technologies are bringing in, which are going to fundamentally change how we think about what is public and what is private. So policing back in 1829 had this big social unrest about the police being created because they were going to curtail people's freedoms. What we've seen in the past 10, 15 years is a similar sort of debate starting to develop about where should the policing role end? From an enforcement perspective, it's what can we get from digital technologies? What can help us to investigate crimes? But some of the things that are happening online now are crime and straightforward crime. And some of the things are people believing that they're in a private place where they should have the right to have a conversation without a big brother overseeing them. And the police have got to get into that conversation. And getting into that conversation, I think, is going to be very difficult with our relationships with the public. And I think we also have to get in that conversation with our staff. Obviously, they're not my staff anymore, with the policing staff, because what we're seeing repeatedly is police officers, both young and older police officers, tripping over things that they think are okay to do because they're in private when they're doing them online, and not realizing that there is no differentiation anymore, that this is all one entity. And I think from a policing perspective, we will see this unravel quite considerably over the next few years as more and more of these issues come to light, and as we learn more and more about the way people think from what they write digitally. From the way people think actually represents how they act, and the relationship between the police and thought is never a good one to have. So I think Peel would recognise lots of things. Now, I wonder if they sat in a room and thought 200 years' time, this is what's going to happen. I don't think that was anywhere near anybody's thoughts. They were thinking, are we going to survive for the next 6 months? And I think there's a lot to take from the Peelian principles, but I really feel it's a time for us to take a very close look at policing and think about what that means in an immensely connected, global and technologically driven world.
Thanks, Rod. May-Britt.
Well, when it comes to the Swedish police and what I know about Robert Peel, we could say it's based on his principles, but at the same time, I would say that I would like to go back, as there is historians obviously in the room, to when the Swedish police more or less started. It was during the 15th and 16th century, we had someone that was both the firefighter and the police officer at the same time, called Snut. And this person walked around when it was darkness out and put on the lamps out in the streets to keep the street to be seen by those that went out in darkness. And they also would alarm the public if something happened, or if it was someone that was too drunk in the street, they would also act with this situation. So within time, you could look at them as preventer already at the time. And that is one of the basic rules I think Robert Peel brought into policing, that the police officers are there to prevent things happening. And they are the service of the public. And I think this is one of the things that we always need to return to when we look at ourselves as police officers, because we are very reactive, extremely reactive, and we normally think that way as soon as something is occurring, that we need to react, we need to do something, we need to put it back into how it should have been. And this is also a way for us to feel needed, of course, because we would like to be needed. We chose this profession because we thought we could put everything back to something like the correct world. The public do have expectation on the police officer, the individual and also the authority. And we need to be prepared to be scrutinized as person or as the whole authority at the same time. Because when I do something in the street, in the police car, or as an investigator, or as a civilian staff member as well, I will be scrutinized by the public and this particular person in front of me, what I did and how I did it. And they might have seen what happened to the person before me when I stood in the line. Did they act the same way against that person as they now do with me? And this is also one of the things that we put into training for police officers. And talking about training, this is extremely different between countries, how we train police officers. Scandinavia, Norway, for example, they got a bachelor degree before they are allowed to go out on the street. 3 years of police training, including a bachelor. In Sweden, 2.5 years. In Denmark, they did a bachelor for a while, changed back because the need of police officers. So they today got 3 different educations, one 6 year, a kind of pre-police officer. And then they got police officers, they do their training, and they also got those with the better training. If we then look at USA to compare to a country that we all try to make decisions about, and we got a view about how they are, 18,000 police authorities, 18,000. I looked at your slides earlier here. I thought it was 48 different police agencies in the UK. In Sweden, we got one national police, like in Scotland. Netherlands got a national police as well. Basically, more or less at the same time, we changed over as you did over here in Scotland to the national. But in USA, it might be if you're in the South States that you got 3 weeks. I said weeks, 3 weeks of training. If you then go up to Wisconsin, you can't even apply to become a police officer unless you can provide a bachelor degree beforehand. And the training, of course, is crucial to what you will deliver as police officer, and if you will live up to the Peel ideas how policing should be delivered to the public. We can also look at the next part of it is how long will I stay in the police? Because if I do the training and if I follow and I do a good probation time as a police officer together with an elderly colleague, I will look at the colleague, I will do as good as I can. I would like to be as good as he or she. If this is a good person, I will be a good police officer. However, there will always be a bad cop. And this person can ruin the future for this police cadet as if we do the training in the wrong way when they do the practical training. This is coming also up then when you think about, I am working still. I said I have 47 years of policing. I'm still working, and my employer asked me to keep on for another year. So 2022, hopefully they will accept my retirement. So I will be at a lady age, this 22 plus. While here in UK, you might end up after 30 years of service. You might be 50 years old. If you go to Poland, you can retire after 20 years of service. So you can have a totally new career in front of you, and you might part-time study at the same time, and you will be seen as a police officer, and you will be seen as the gardener or whatever you would like to. So there is so many options given to you. So when Robert Peel talked about prevention, I agreed with him, because that is the first thing that we need to do. Secondly, we always need to investigate. And if the legislation is in harmony, there will be good service to the public and we will be trusted. So there are a lot to think about when you are out there meeting the public and you think about Robert Peel. I think he had very good ideas, but that it's many years back and we need to re-evaluate on the road into the future. This is the same for like associations. Otherwise we lose our members and there will be no volunteers. I heard about the volunteers earlier. And this is the same with the police. If we do not follow what happens out there in the society, we will be the losers and we will not be needed. There will be other people taking over. And I had a question in one of the breaks. Why are there so many private security companies in Sweden? Because we are too few police officers and we can't do all the service to the public. And then we instead engage with private companies to protect certain things that is not policing any longer. And I have seen this also here in UK. I think I'll stop here and leave something for a little bit later. So thank you.
Thanks, May-Britt. Yes, so Jonathan, would Robert Peel recognise the police of 2021?
Right. Can we all hear myself all right? I don't use microphones other than ill-advised karaoke sessions, but I could not believe when this question came up. I really couldn't. I mean, as a fan of Robert Peel, as a supposed specialist in Victorian policing, I thought I couldn't possibly get any better than that. Yes, absolutely. Robert Peel would recognise policing of 2021, no doubt. He'd recognise the function, he'd recognise common statement, purpose, he'd recognise command and control structures. So I think, yes, he would absolutely recognise it. He would also recognise the need to reform as well. You know, Peel was a great reformer, far more than actually the other prime ministers that have been previously. I know he obviously later became prime minister, but he was a big reformer, and he would have understood the need to reflect the social construct. So adapt in order to survive, which actually one of the esteemed colleagues previously mentioned, the importance of actually adapting and adapting how we do things in order to reflect the issues that we're facing. And Robert Peel would have certainly recognised that. But the Victorian period is such a transformative period, really. And in many respects, how we do things and how we do business now is nothing like what we would have done in 1829. So I think you've got to recognise those things. So yes, I would fundamentally say he would recognise it. I don't think he would recognise tech. I can't imagine how difficult that would have been to try and explain to Robert Peel, by the way, we've got these things called computers and, you know, this is how things are done. I'm not sure they would understand that. But fundamentally, yes, I think he would. So that's me.
Thank you. Just some really interesting responses there. I think some key things that have just jumped out to me, really thinking about what we need to focus on, structural change that's happening into our societies, scrutiny of police and reform, all talked about there, as well as that real variety of approaches globally as well. I'd like to open up to the floor. Anyone got any questions? Lots of questions. So I think, should we start over there, as that's where the mic is, and then we'll move across. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me there? Yeah, I'm David Lewis from Associates at the LPC. I've got a question about police legitimacy around the use of military and the military force. We've heard a lot about partnership working and the pandemic, and we've increasingly seen in the last year and 18 months the use of the army. They've turned out for floods, and they've turned out for driving for the transport dispute, and they've now turned out obviously massively for the pandemic. Particularly in terms of intelligence and the general use of the military, where are we drifting towards, if at all? Do you have any concerns as a panel about the use of the military in the policing function?
Thank you, David. Rod?
Yeah, I think I'd be more concerned if I was a member of the military command about how their soldiers were being used in a completely different format. I think there's quite an interesting shift in a belief that the military are a cheap version of backfilling where there's a problem in society, which I think is completely undermining the professional skills of the Army, Air Force, Navy. And that for me is quite a concern. I think the other concern is from a professional policing perspective and from a paramedic perspective or from any of the other professions, the belief that people can be briefed to do a job which other people have spent many years learning how to do is actually undermining the skills required to carry out the role. So I think it's quite problematic when we move away from the use of the military in very contained specific roles to bring their own specialist skills to support policing into this more generalised, we're just going to get bodies from where we can get them because it doesn't cost a lot of money. So that would probably be enough.
Thank you. If everyone's okay, I'd like to move on to the next question so all the questioners get a chance to speak. If you're happy with that. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Just picking up on Maybrit's point, talking about training and academic degrees. Just wonder what the panel's feelings are on whether that creates a problem for Peelian principles and representing a society as a police force if you are requiring people to have an academic degree, particularly for perhaps people that are changing careers or perhaps people that don't want to do a degree.
Okay. Jonathan, do you want to pick up on that one and then maybe come to Maybrit?
Yeah. Well, firstly, if we're going to keep Robert Peel, you can tell there's a bit of a fanboy thing going on here. He would have actually totally understood the professionalisation agenda. He would have totally understood the PQF, because he had a radical idea, for example, that police officers should be able to read and write. so he really understood the importance of upskilling and going with the times. And so he would definitely do it. So I don't think it does clash with the Peelian principles. There's a misconception. I spend unfortunately, a lot of my time in archives and not seeing sunlight for days. And actually, historically, the police have always educated themselves. They've always been upskilling in order to deal with issues as they arise. So no, absolutely not. I don't think there's a clash. I would say this, though, is that there's a misconception about the Peelian principles. Peel never actually wrote them. Those 9 principles that you see and we hold in such a regard, he never actually wrote them. They were wrote in the 1950s and 60s in textbooks. He did say about the police of the public of the police, sort of, because what he actually said was a working class force for a working class community. That's what he actually said. So it has changed over time to a certain extent, but he would fundamentally recognise the need to upskill, professionalise in order to tackle crime and prevent crime. So that would be my view on it.
Thank you.
I need to speak with a double tongue. It's known in the USA that you can do that. As a police officer, if you think about how I was educated many years back, I would have said, no, there is no need for a bachelor degree or further training or anything else. I just wanted to do my basic police training, go out in the street, drive fast with a car and hunt for all the thieves that I could find. And after 2 years, I started to ask myself, why is all this happening? That is how I started my further training myself. I started to read, I started to search for answers to my questions. And today, also been working with the Swedish Police Federation, that is a union. We are allowed to strike. You are not in this country. So what we are really fighting for a police education that would give a bachelor to police officers in Sweden. And we also want those that are in the profession of today to be evaluated, to become a degree and to get a good degree and also be seen as educated, because the experience also gives you a lot of knowledge. So the way of giving a good training will also deliver better policing and better understanding for why crime is happening and why the public is acting as they do from time to time. Because it's not always criminals that we are handling. You remember the question I had this morning about mental illnesses. We are jack of all trades. I think you used that expression over here. And there's further words in that line. And we need to do everything. Babysitting, baking. We need to be able to do a lot more than this basic policing. And if we don't do good training, we will not be able to deliver. So yes, on your question, I think it would be good if all police officers would receive a proper training, schooling. A bachelor could be the start of it. And for police leaders, I can see the need for them to do further training, because leadership is not everything that you are born with. Some people are born to be leader, others need to be trained to become the leader.
Thanks, Maybrit. Next question, please. There's one here. Thanks.
Thank you. Lizzie, I was just intrigued by your choice of structural change, and I wanted to link back to the first speaker today when we talked about a cultural change. And I'm interested about the confused position perhaps around the National Police Chief Council and the support for academia, and just ask, are we yet a network of learning organisations, or to bring in Professor Wakefield, or is this yet to be identified as the biggest of super wicked problems?
Thank you. Rod, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, have a go. Thanks, Ian. Nice, easy one. My starting point is that I think policing has to be absolutely rooted in local communities. So however the governance and overall structure is created, it has to build up from what's happening in local communities in providing services locally in the right context and the right solution for people. But I think 48 police forces in the United Kingdom is completely wrong. I think it creates a huge imbalance in power. So you end up with the Met Police, because of its size, being able to almost railroad other forces to follow policy and practice. And because of the Met size, the way that we see police activity in London drives data across the country. So if you look at stop and search data, if policing in London was completely proportionate in terms of stop and search data, it would make the national figures disproportionate, because the difference in how the community is created would change the overall figures. And you would still end up with being more likely to be stops and search in the United Kingdom if you're black than if you're white. And that creation of a body which has a disproportionate impact on data and outcomes, a disproportionate voice, and a very close alignment with central government makes it incredibly difficult for the other chief constables and the other police and crime commissioners to drive policy forward and to develop appropriate ways. And I think because of that, organisational learning gets lost, because each chief and each police and crime commissioner is trying to make their own case for their own force in their own area based upon doing something different from the other 47. So if we could rationalise down to a more sensible regional approach, but keep it built up by local BCUs working with local communities, I think we would make a huge step forward in networking learning and being able to move things across from one place to another.
Thanks, Rod. Maybrit or Jonathan, would you like to add? Yeah.
Well, we've done that travel in Sweden many years back when I joined the police, historically, very long time ago. We had more than 100 police districts in Sweden, and it was a lot of small places that could be forgotten more or less if you looked at the headquarters that we had one in Stockholm at the time. And then years later, we moved in to have less than 70. And this was not enough, because we saw the problems between all these different sizes of the forces. So 2015, we moved to the national police and we divided the country into 7 regions. It being really a big baby to take care of and to feed it. But at the same time, we facing the exactly the same kind of going through system. We try to make it as national as possible. There is not a Stockholm syndrome in the way that we all listen to what they do in the big city. We try to have an average of the country. And I agree with you. I had very interesting discussions when I did my master at Cambridge University with some politicians that came to our evening sessions. And some were absolutely against this, because they could see that the tax they pay for the police on the local level in some areas would be given to some other area that had more problems. So you need to have a thought of solidarity if you move in to have regions in the country. And this is what we already been, well, I was born into solidarity. It's a country of solidarity. So I think we even though we had problems to bring these 7 regions together to one national police with the same way of looking at it, I think it's been healthy for the police organization, as it has been healthy for the public as well, for citizens.
Thank you. Really interesting to hear about that positive change there. We're going to move on to the next question. So the next question So we're going to try and keep quite focused so we can get to the last question as well, because I like the last question. Is there a crisis in police legitimacy? And maybe if we start with you, please.
Yes and no. It's absolutely not an easy question to answer to, but we had really a crisis after the George Floyd thing, and that affected not only the USA and particularly the police at the scene or in the state when it happened. It affected the rest of the Western world, more or less. Every country where we had people coming from different countries joining together and formed a country, it went to be demonstrations. It started to be an issue about what police officers did or didn't. And I think that went to be the kind of opening possibility. It wouldn't, in my way of looking at it, if it hadn't been the pandemic, it wouldn't have been as large as it went to be. Due to the pandemic, I think it went to be something to react to, with the lockdowns, with the restrictions, all these horrible things. And also it was enough. We had enough. Everyone had enough. A police officer did something that was not accepted. A person had to give his life, even though he had done bad things, he shouldn't die. That was one of the things we had to think about. And many people lost the trust in the police at that time. And they started to speak about defunding the police. People started to speak about the training of the police and. At the same time, half a year later, it was not forgotten, but when the public saw the justice system, how they reacted to what happened, that was when we started to build back the trust in the police. And I believe that the trust is there back, not really at the same level as it used to be in USA, but in most of the other countries where we had reactions.
Thanks, Mobrit. Jonathan?
Well, I would probably take a slightly different position. I think there are significant issues around legitimacy and policing in the UK, and as a result of the way that messaging happens internationally. I think listening to Hannah speak earlier on about the amount of effort that has been put in by police leaders and communities to support their local police during this time of immense strain is a sign that there are really strong connections and a lot of good support. But I think when you look at some of the underlying data about differential outcomes for people from different backgrounds, and when you start looking at differential outcomes in terms of the service to women and men, I think when you put all of that together, there are such risks to the police maintaining their legitimacy that unless we say it is highly at risk, we will miss the opportunity to save what we have got in terms of local support and what we have got for the officers who, from my perspective, do the most incredibly difficult job, put themselves at risk all the time. We heard this morning about no PPE, having to make a decision not to take the vaccination, not to argue to vaccinate your own staff because you think it's more important to save other people's lives than to save the life of the person standing next to you. Those sorts of selfless acts are incredibly widely replicated through policing and are right at the core of what most police officers do on a daily basis. But when you put that together with a very small number of people who do things which are absolutely grotesquely wrong, and a set of data which shows disproportionality in terms of the use of powers and the outcomes for inquiries, I think there is a real issue that has to be addressed really urgently if it's not to get out of control.
Thank you, Rob. Jonathan?
I'll be very quick. Well, I actually think there is a wider crisis of legitimacy amongst state apparatus, actually. I think the failure of the neoliberal model, whether you agree with it or not, has left a great deal of inequality and a lot of disenfranchised young people. who feel that, and also, of course, they're very tech savvy as well, and they feel that the state systems don't represent them. I think if you look at what happened recently in COP26, really we're yet to see the outcomes of that. And many of my students have said to me, what was the point of it? It didn't represent us. It didn't represent anything that our futures. It didn't protect our futures. It's just a load of people squabbling. So I think it's that actually that we need to really challenge. And of course, because policing is front facing, because the men and women of policing deal with it on a daily basis, you will have the issues. But I think it's much wider than that. Unfortunately, I think partly it's because you no longer control the narrative. Whether you like to admit it or not, you don't. Social media and ideological structures can set up anti-police messages much quicker than you can deal with it. So I think there is this discussion about whether you're in a chronic crisis of legitimacy. I don't have the answer to that, but I certainly think that we really need to get back on message and put much more positive message out, which I think these events do really, and young people need to be aware of those things. So that would be me.
Thank you. Some really powerful insights there. Anyone in the room have a question? Or Denise? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I suppose my question is actually about legitimacy in a different format, and that's internal legitimacy. We talked a lot about resilience of police officers and a lot that they've gone through in terms of the pandemic and the work that they've had to do, particularly in the front line. I've done some research myself, and actually morale being quite low and them having quite a negative experience and feeling quite, that actually the legitimacy of the organisation to them because of their experiences on the front line. So just wondering how important you think that is to ensure that legitimacy, legitimacy or organisational justice is just as important as external legitimacy.
Thank you. Who would like to pick that one up? Go on.
Yeah, I think I think that there are 2 points here which are very similar. What Jonathan was saying about this wider issue in society, this wider issue of discussion around what historically was seen as the right cultural norms and ways of doing things, and what people are expressing in a different format, plays directly into what you're talking about. And I think I've always felt this, for the last 40 years. I think the cops on the front line feel that nobody loves them even, and that everyone wants them to go home. When the reality is that the vast majority of people, when they call for the police, are calling for something they really believe will help them, and will really do them some good. And I think it's really sad that however hard in the past we've tried, and however hard we're trying at the moment to get that message through, that quite often the frontline cops don't hear that. And they hear the angst which is aimed at society, focused on them as individuals, and they internalize that and have to deal with that on a daily basis. And I really think that we need to find a way of actually changing that conversation. For me, the thing that really did start to change that was community-based policing, and getting officers very closely aligned with the local community, working on joint initiatives locally, because they started to get the feedback that what they were doing was making a difference. If you spend all your days running from one call to another call to another call, where you're not actually changing anything, you're basically collecting data for Home Office figures, because none of it's leading to an outcome. It doesn't fill you with a great feeling of I did well today. Whereas if we could get cops back more aligned with hearing from Mrs. Miggins, if you like, about how wonderful the service was and how things are better, it could change that. So I think your question you're talking about goes to the heart of what Jonathan was talking about as well, in terms of we've got to get much better at this communication connectedness, and we've got to realise that the majority of our staff are now involved in conversations that we don't even know about.
Thank you. Any more points before we move on to the final question? Oh, is there a question there? Sorry.
Thank you. A
Thanks.
short question, hopefully short answers. And Lizzie, I'm going to ask you this as well. So just so that it's not just the three panelists. This is an international police educational conference. Leaving aside for reasons of panel makeup, Sweden and the UK, if panelists could send a new police recruit to any country in the world for a 6-month secondment, where would they send them and why?
I'll be really provocative and start.
Go on.
Very short. I would send them to China. I would send them to China predominantly to break a whole load of thought processes about what happens in China. There are a whole load of things which are completely inappropriate, but their police education process and the way that they've gone about increasing the skills of their staff to be able to respond to digital issues, to investigate in a forensically complicated world, to respond. I mean, when you look at the public order response in Hong Kong, in a way of actually being able to respond in a very complex political world with a set of proportionate skills, I think it would be really useful. I wouldn't want them to come back and make this China. That's not what I'm saying at all, but I think there is something there which would be really interesting and useful for people.
That was my first thought, China. But then I thought, no, I've been to China, and when you started to speak about it, no, I would send my police officer to Kyrgyzstan. And why Kyrgyzstan? Because Kyrgyzstan used to have a militia, and they're trying to change this militia into a democratic police. And it would be really interesting for them to meet one that working according to the legislation in the country and are not military police officers. They are real police officers and they are trained to be that. And I think it would be really interesting for them to see how a former Soviet state is now working independently with their own freedom and try to come closer to Europe. So that's the reason why I sent my police officer Sweden to Kyrgyzstan.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm going to mix it up, actually, if you don't mind. I'd send them back in time. I would. I genuinely would, actually. I would send them back to different time periods in Britain to sort of dispel some of the myths I think that we have over history. So I'd certainly send them back to 1829, and I would show actually the realities and what Peel was facing, the urbanisation, the industrialisation, and all those complexities. I'd send them there. I would also send them to the 1950s, the golden age, which I know I'm allowed to speak about today. And sort of this kind of where it really was a very different model than what we use. Probably Mrs. Miggins' model, if you don't mind me saying so. Mrs. Miggins gets mentioned a lot. I'd like to meet this Mrs. Miggins. But that's what I would do, actually. Rather than send them internationally, I would send them back in time to really reevaluate our history and the journey that we've taken to get to where we have. And that might actually allow us to appreciate how professional British policing is and why we are the envy of other parts of the world. So that's what I would do.
Well, I was torn and I've been all around the globe in my head, I have to say. But I think ultimately, I think back to Maybritt's point, I might send them to a small place in the US where there is a lot of use of guns and where the police officers are very, very under-educated or under-trained. Again, almost to give them a sense of what we do have here and what we have built here and how precious it is as well. So I think that's what I would do. Okay. And no one else is out to ask me any questions. I'm not here to answer questions at all. So the final question I think we come to this afternoon, but almost the flip side, and I think we've touched on this already a little bit, but to Jonathan first, have the police ever been loved?
So not an easy question. I love the title of it as well. It sounds like a bit of a kind of Lionel Richie song, really. Have they ever been loved? Yes, actually, in reality, I mean, it's a point obviously made by a colleague. Yes, there have been periods of time where the police have been very much loved by the public. I mean, if we're using loved as the definition of that being, largely positive public perception and legitimacy, then yes, you'd have to go back to the 1950s and the 1960s. The so-called golden age of policing, Robert Reiner and Rowe, and those who talk very, very much about that period. You'd have to go back to then. The key why it was a golden age in the 1940s and 50s was really twofold. The first was about visibility. Police officers were much more visible than what they are today. And that, as a result, provided a sense of reassurance for members of the public. They were there for them, and it was very much as close to that police of the public and police as you're going to get. The second, which I think I've alluded to already, is the control of the narrative. Let's be honest, the media have always challenged policing. If you went back to 1888, there was some pretty distasteful stuff written about the Metropolitan Police taking on Jack the Ripper. They've never been really in huge support. But what the police were able to do was to control what was actually being put out there. And I think that's what ultimately made it a golden age. If we move to 2021, firstly, and these are some of the points that Rod was alluding to, visibility is gone, really. I was speaking to my students prior to this. Really, they'll only come into contact with a police officer if they're an offender or they're a victim. That's it. So the visibility isn't there. They don't feel part or they don't feel connected to them. There's the dehumanization effect as a result. The second is, of course, that you don't control the narrative anymore. And that with technology being the way it is, the power to the individual citizen has meant that, in effect, negative views and negative perceptions of the police can be formulated very, very quickly and spread. This is what the RAND Corporation call truth decay. And unfortunately, we are policing in a world where what is truth anymore? That's another thing, of course, which was very clear in the 1940s and 50s. It was clearly defined what was going on, mostly because of the post-war consensus. So whereas now what is true, what is right and wrong is very much subjective and very much dependent on who you speak to at whatever time that you speak to. So I think that in answer to your question, have they ever been loved? Yes, there have been periods of being loved. But of course, I'm afraid to say, as many of you, academics and are aware, the golden age was not actually that golden, really. It was golden for the police in the respective that you could get away with a lot. But actually, in terms of delivery of justice, it was very poor. There was high levels of corruption, there was high levels of malpractice. And so one of the things I always say to students is that there's a real issue with policing in history. We think of the 20th century, we think, oh, great, golden age, but it actually wasn't. Whereas in the 21st century, we think it's bad and it's actually very good. So it's kind of like switched over in the two centuries. So have they ever been loved? Yes. Of course, the bigger question, which may be open to the panel, is do we actually need to be loved? Is it important that we're loved? Or is it actually much more important that we're just simply respected and that, we're appreciated for the job that you guys do? I think that's maybe much more of an important question to ask ourselves. But obviously, I welcome it up to the rest of them.
Thank you. We've been getting the sort of 2-minute warning. So, and we've got some quick responses, Rod and Maybritt, please.
Well, if I look at my own police force back home in Sweden, I can say there are four times that I really, during my time as police officer, seen us being loved. The first time is after a really bad robbery where the robbers killed 2 police officers, Alexander. This was during the 1990s. This really upset the whole nation when it happened. And still on the day, every year, it's in the newspaper, and we are loved for 124 hours in memory of these 2 people that had to sacrifice their lives in this chase that happened at that time. The second time, I really had the feeling that we were loved by the citizens, and we were particularly loved by the people in Gothenburg, in 2001, when we had violent riots due to the EU summit, where people came from all over Europe and crashed our city, and the police went to be injured in massive numbers. and the public loved us. They knew that we came out on the street to protect them. However, after a few weeks, when the journalists started to write to the opposite side, they hated us. So they loved us at that time for 3 weeks, and then nothing in the media and any anniversaries any longer around our really heavy work at that time. The Stockholm terrorist attack at Drottninggatan, you probably saw the pictures from that one. It's just a few years back when everyone went to buy roses, not only in Stockholm, but all over the country, and put onto the police cars wherever we parked. That was also a time when the Swedish people loved their police, and they still remember us for what happened. People had to also at that time to sacrifice their lives, but that was the public, and the police came out and protected them very, very quickly, and we caught this terrorist as well. And finally, the fourth. Sadly, we had one police officer, a young police officer this summer murdered in this group violence. And we are still loved, and we still speak about him, and we still speak about the good of the police in my country. So they do love us when we are in danger, or the public are in severe danger. They love us because they know that we will be there for them.
Thank you, Rod.
3 very quick points. I think the first one is far more importantly about than whether the police are loved is how much the police love their job and what they're doing, and the importance of that selflessness which comes from it, which is at the heart of policing. Second thing, probably, I've always been at this point that when both sides of an argument hate you, you've probably just about got it right in policing terms. So expecting to be loved is always going to be a difficult thing to have. But overall, I would say that people genuinely do love the British police. I think there is a very strong love affair. The problem with it, when something becomes that emotional, every time the police let them down, and however small they let them down, it is felt as a personal affront within a relationship rather than a professional transactional issue. So I think the police are loved, and I think they do love their job and they do love the public, but it's not perhaps what we can survive.
Thank you. Sorry, there won't be time for any more questions just now, but I think hopefully that discussion's given us all some real food for thought. I think it's certainly given us a sense of some of the challenges, some of which are within policing's reach to change, and I think some of which are probably outside, but it's certainly given me a sense of, and a sort of renewed sense of what we need to do in policing to continue to build legitimacy and to build back the trust where that's been eroded. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you, panel. Thank you.